Building your weapon loadouts for Hipfire in Warzone 2 is definitely a fun and viable playstyle that you need to try out. In today's video, we've got our 5 recommendations of the best Hipfire builds currently in Warzone 2 that enable you to play aggressively in close range fights and are built in a way that you will never need to ADS. We're starting off today with our current favourite Hipfire loadout, and it's for the Minibak SMG. This currently sits as a gun which a lot of people really enjoy using, but it hasn't reached the top tier of the kind of standard meta, especially for ADSing. But as a Hipfire gun, this gun does absolute wonders. It's got a nice big mag, it hits really hard, and it's got really good accuracy with the build we're going to give you. So we're beginning today with the only barrel that we have available for the Minibak, and that is the Back 9 279mm barrel. It gives us damage range and bullet velocity, which when we pair with a nice buff to hipfire accuracy, actually means we can hipfire this out to kind of short to mid range, longer than you think you should be able to. And it can be very, very tilting for people when they realize they've been killed by a Hipfire SMG from the kind of range you can kill people with this thing. It's a lot of fun. The aim down sight speed we don't care about losing here, and the hip recoil control, it's not the most important stat, even though it has the word hip in it, and we are going to gain some of that back later on anyway, so don't worry too much about that. For the tuning here and for all the other attachments later in the video, you'll see we do not max out the bars in many of our examples. That is because you can see by pushing these further out, you actually start having negative effects that are shown on this bar chart. And so if you're seeing any creators recommending you push these bars all the way to the edges, they're telling you wrong, and they are definitely out of date with their builds. The tuning here is fairly obvious. We're finding our optimum recoil steadiness and damage range, mainly because the other options we have of aim walking speed and aim down sight speed are not necessary for a Hipfire build. Next up, we're moving on to probably the most important attachment for any Hipfire build in Warzone 2, and that's going to be the laser. Specifically, we're going to be using the F-Tac Grimline laser. It gives 3 really important stats here. We've got the hipfire accuracy, we're gaining back some of the hip recoil control which we lost from our barrel, and we also get sprint to fire speed. Now, ADS speed, obviously we're not going to be focusing in at all for this, but sprint to fire speed is pretty much all that gates us between when we're sprinting and when we can actually begin to fire our weapon from our hip. So as much sprint to fire speed as we can get is really, really important for our hipfire build. There's no tuning available on the laser, so we'll move next onto a stock for pure mobility. It's going to be the VLK stockless. Typically these stockless or collapsed stocks have a lot of cons to do with things like aiming stability and recoil control, which we don't really care too much about in a primarily focused hipfire build. The pros here are all really good. We've got hip recoil control, movement speed, and sprint to fire speed, which are all great. And the ADS speed, I guess, is just a nice bonus if you need to ADS and you do decide you want to try and take an ADS fight on this Hipfire build. You might want to do that as well. So we're covering all of our bases here with this really, really nice mobility focused stock. Once again, no tuning available for the VLK stockless, so we would usually move on to something like an underbarrel on a lot of these builds, but there's no underbarrel available. Instead, we have this interesting mechanic for the Minibak where you actually chuck on this Minibak grip magazine, and this gives you an improved amount of rounds in the gun. You get 64 rounds, which is very nice, but you also have this attachment that actually sort of works like an underbarrel. You get some recoil stabilization and aiming idle stability, which isn't that important, and the only con you lose is ADS speed. So essentially we're getting the obvious benefit of more bullets, but with some nice little pros added on, which you wouldn't get typically for a lot of extra mags you would put on your guns. And there's no tuning available for that, so we'll move on to the final attachment for the Minibak hipfire build, and that's going to be a rear grip, where we're going to chuck on the Ivanov ST70 grip. This gives a real good boost to flinch resistance, which we found to be a really helpful stat when it comes to hip firing. One of the worst things that can happen is you start hip firing, you get someone low, and then they land a couple of bullets on you, you start flinching, and you really feel it in that hipfire mode. Your crosshair actually starts flying off of the enemy, you miss a couple of shots, and before you know it, you're dead. So flinch resistance is really important, and we love the Ivanov grip for that. And luckily we do have some tuning on this rear grip. We're going to be optimizing our recoil steadiness, pulling our slider to 0.74, and then on the bottom one we're moving towards sprint to fire speed, that golden stat that we've talked about multiple times, minus 0.2 on here. The other 2 stats here, aim down sight speed and aiming idle stability, once again, not something we're focusing on for a hipfire build. Next up, we've got a build for a gun we just had to cover. It is the gun we all love to hate right now. It's the Fennec. This gun is absolutely deleting people as soon as you pull the trigger, and this hipfire build means you can do all of that without even needing to aim down your sight. So let's begin with the barrel that is pretty much what everyone's running on their meta build already. It's going to be the ZLR 16.5 inch ignition barrel. Sorry, a bit of a mouthful there. It gives us some nice buffs to damage range, bullet velocity, and hip fire accuracy. We do lose a bit of movement speed, which isn't the best, but we will gain back some of our mobility later on, and damage range and bullet velocity are too good to miss out on a lot of our SMGs, especially when we're hip firing. It allows us to keep contesting out into slightly mid-range fights with a hip fire build. For the tuning, we found our sweet spots for recoil steadiness and damage range, and we've moved away from the stats we don't care as much about here, the aim walking speed and the ADS speed. Similar to our Minibak build, the laser is going to be very important, and the one we love for the Fennec is going to be the Point G3P04. This gives all of the same stats as the previous laser. It's focusing on sprint to fire speed, one of our golden stats for hip fire accuracy, as well as the duo of hip recoil control and hip fire accuracy. There's no tuning on the laser, so we're actually going to move on to an underbarrel here, and we really like for the Fennec this phase 3 grip. You do lose out on some walking speed, which isn't the most important thing, and ADS speed we don't care about, but we are gaining some very, very nice hip fire accuracy. You feel it a lot from putting on this attachment, especially on the Fennec. The aiming idle stability is fairly useless, but the recoil stabilization is helping under the hood. You don't really notice it too much when you're firing because you don't see it as much as when you actually aim down your sight, but it's definitely still doing the job for you. And then for the tuning on the phase 3 grip, we are buffing up our recoil stabilization. Once again, it's doing some work under the hood while we're hip firing. And then the bottom slider doesn't seem like it's going to do much because we've got aim walking speed versus aiming idle stability. In general, of the two in Warzone 2, aiming idle stability is a far more important stat because having nice idle aim while you're ADSing means you land a lot more shots. And we found that by bringing this up to 0.22, you really don't lose out on much, if any, aim walking speed, and you just get a little buff to the aiming idle stability. It's not going to make much difference. This is just the tuning that we found to be the best. We're then switching things up by putting on some ammunition. We're really liking these auto overpressured rounds, which give target flinch, but you lose out on a bit of recoil control, which once again you're not going to feel as much when you're running a hipfire build. This target flinch, however, is absolutely disgusting to use against enemies, especially on a gun that fires bullets out as quick as the Fennec does. You start hitting a couple of shots and it becomes very, very difficult for enemies to fire back. We're then going to get ourselves some slightly snappier shots with tuning towards bullet velocity with the sweet spot there, 5.23, and we've also buffed up for a sweet spot of damage range. It's actually only a little bit up on the slider here to get that damage range we need, which is 0.18. And finally, so we can support the high fire rate of the gun, and we're obviously focusing on trying to land shots with these overpressured rounds, we need a magazine bump. So we're going to put on the Fennec Mag 45, buffing up our capacity to 45 rounds. You do lose out on some kind of nice mobility stats, but the Fennec is pretty much unusable without this bigger mag. You just run through bullets way too quick, and you've got to consider that some of those bullets will miss, especially on a hip fire build, so it's just necessary that you need to run it. Next up today, we've got a gun which you probably haven't put in a loadout much before, and that's the Vel 46. Now, I can guarantee you've picked this up at some point from ground loot, and you've done some absolute work with it. We have, and so we wanted to try out making a hip fire build for it, and we've definitely found something that really competes in this hip fire category, and you need to give it a shot. Beginning once again with the barrel, we're going to be trying to extend that damage range out, and we're going to be choosing this Schlager RVB. It gives all of the stats we want from a barrel, bullet velocity, damage range, and also the hip fire accuracy, losing out on a bit of the mobility from the movement speed, which we'll gain later on from one of our other attachments, so you don't need to worry too much about it. We've then tuned that up to sweet spots for recoil steadiness and damage range. We don't care about aim walking speed or ADS speed. We need a laser again for this SMG hipfire build, and it's going to be the Point G3P04, the exact same one we had unlocked on the Fennec. This is giving us our trifecta of sprint to fire speed, hip fire accuracy, and hip recoil control, just turning this gun into the hip fire machine it really can be. No tuning for the laser once again, so we're going to move on to the stock, where we're going to be focusing on mobility. That mobility we said we were going to get back that we lost from our barrel, we're going to get it from this collapsed stock. Very similar to all the other collapsed stocks in the game, we're getting all of the mobility stats you can think of. ADS speed, we don't mind too much about, but it's nice to have it as a pro as and when we need it. But the sprint to fire speed, the movement speed, and that hip recoil control, you're going to feel all of that really nicely from using this collapsed stock. Unfortunately, once again, no tuning that we can have there, so we're going to move on to the underbarrel, and similar to the Fennec, we're going to be putting on the Phase 3 grip. It feels pretty much to be the best overall hip fire underbarrel you can have at the moment. That hip fire accuracy feels absolutely amazing with this grip. And the tuning here stays the same. We've got our sweet spot for recoil stabilization, 0.57, and then we've got two stats at the bottom that we don't care too much about, but the sweet spot between them in general, favoring that aiming idle stability as and when we need it, is going to be 0.22. And then finally, we had to make the choice between ammunition and a bigger mag. We do find that this gun doesn't have too crazy of a fire rate, and it already has a decent sized mag of 40 rounds, so we actually prefer to go for our ammunition, once again going for the overpressured rounds. I just can't state enough how good this target flinch pro is that you get from using these rounds. You cannot get it from any other attachment within the gunsmith, and it turns this hipfire build into something that's very difficult to counter once you start landing shots. It would be an easy mistake to just make our tuning match what we had for the Fennec, but you've got to remember that these are actually different overpressured rounds. These are 4.6mm rounds as opposed to the ones we had on the Fennec, so the tuning is slightly different. So the sweet spots here for bullet velocity 5.06 and damage range up by 0.17. Next up, we've got reliable. It's the Lachmann sub, also known as the MP5. This was always a beast as a hipfire gun in Warzone 1, and we've got a build here for you guys that it might be our second favorite to the Minibak that we mentioned earlier. The build's going to follow very similar to the Vel that we just crafted, so we're starting off with our longest barrel, the FTAC M sub barrel, giving us that bullet velocity and damage range, helping us compete, still hip firing out into the mid-range, and hip fire accuracy on top. For optimized tuning, we're sticking with the stats we've been putting on all of our barrels today: recoil steadiness and damage range. These are the ideal sweet spots for those stats. Our laser is going to be the same as the last two, the Point G3P04, giving that trifecta of amazing hipfire stats. Don't need to go into the details of all that. It's just something you need to have on this gun for the hipfire build. And with no tuning available there, we move on to the stock. Again, it's going to be the stockless mod. It's always going to be the collapsed or the stockless or whatever it's called, the thing that basically chops the stock off and gets you moving around as quick as possible. Maxing out our sprint to fire speed, movement speed, hip recoil control, all lovely stuff for the hipfire build. No tuning once again there, so shock, we've got an underbarrel, and it's going to be the Phase 3 grip once again, our favorite underbarrel for hipfire accuracy overall. I said it in the last video and I'll say it again, can we please get attachment by attachment tuning saving, and also just in general saving your loadouts overall? It'd be really nice if I tune up this phase grip on one of my guns, then I can put it onto another gun and have preset tuning. I don't have to drag this slider exactly every time. Anyway, we're focusing on recoil stabilization once again, sweet spot here of 0.57, and then we've got the stats we don't care as much about, but the sweet spot overall in between the two of them is 0.22 towards aiming idle stability. And for the Lachmann sub, we had to choose between our lovely overpressured rounds and a bigger mag, and we just had to go with a bigger mag for the Lachmann. It does fire pretty quickly, and the default magazine size just doesn't really cope as an SMG, so we like putting on the 50 round mag, just going, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound, get as much ammo in this thing as you can and take out multiple enemies as you're pushing through a building. Our final recommendation today is going to be the FSS Hurricane, which a lot of people are really enjoying using. It feels really reliable in the hand, partly because it sort of feels a bit like an AR disguised as an SMG, kind of similar to how the Castov 74U feels like an SMG disguised as an AR. So this thing always handles really well in the hand, and this hipfire build absolutely slaps. We're going to start by chucking on the FSS X7 barrel. It gives some built-in sound suppression, which is a really nice addition to have as part of a barrel. Just means we're kept as low profile as possible while spraying from the hip, and then on top we're getting hip fire accuracy, bullet velocity, damage range, all the nice stuff that we really want for this build. We're going to tune that up with some nice recoil steadiness and damage range, similar to the barrels previously in the video. For our laser, we're going back to the FTAC Grimline laser, similar to what we had on the Minibak. We don't have access to the other laser that we were using on our other guns, but it gives the same stats. It's basically the same thing. It gives us the hip recoil control, the hip fire accuracy, and the sprint to fire speed, which we want for our hipfire build. No tuning available there, so onto the stock. We're going to be using the Demo Quicksilver Collapsed. Make sure you're not accidentally making the mistake mistake of using the demo Quicksilver. They do look kind of similar, but you can notice one of them it's out, one of them it's in. The key difference being is that the demo Quicksilver collapsed gives you really nice boosts to sprint to fire speed, as well as some of those other nice mobility bonuses. No tuning again, so the underbarrel we're sticking with the Phase 3 grip. I know some of these videos can get a little bit boring when I'm going on and on about the same attachment every single time, but it hopefully means that if you guys haven't used the Phase 3 before, you will start learning, okay, if I'm going to build a Hipfire build, I'm just going to chuck on the Phase 3 and I'm going to chuck on this laser, and you can start forming some builds for yourselves in the future. It's all a learning process. Tuning here is same as we've had it on our other guns where we've had the Phase 3, so I won't go into all the details. The gun has an integrated magazine of 50 rounds that we can't change, and that's a really nice amount to start off with, so it makes our final attachment choice very easy. It's going to be the overpressured rounds for that insane target flinch pro on the Hipfire build. And the best tuning for these overpressured rounds to finish up the build is going to be 6.12 towards bullet velocity on the bottom slider, and then moving up to 0.45 on the damage range slider on the left. Everyone thought that the Hipfire meta was completely gone in Warzone 2 and it would never reach where it was in Warzone 1. Yes, it's not as good as it was, but it's definitely a very viable and extremely fun playstyle that you need to try out in some of your builds, so hopefully one of these 5 suits your playstyle the most and you can jump in and have some fun. Now, one of the biggest changes which came to Warzone 2 is the fact that you don't get your loadouts from buy stations. Instead, you're going to have to just buy a single weapon, and you need it to be as versatile as possible to handle all ranges. So how about you next check out our previous video where we covered our top 5 recommendations for versatile weapons that can cover the long and the close range. Thank you very much for watching, guys. We'll see you guys next time.